Christians are supposed to give 10%. You probably heard that before, but that's kind of a hunk of change, isn't it? 10% of your income. 10% off the top, given to the church. Maybe you've heard the opposite. Maybe people have told you that's Old Testament thinking. Tithing doesn't apply anymore. Well, which is it? We have to talk about this because it isn't some minor issue. Churches teach this. Christians argue about it. People feel guilty about this. And a lot of believers have never actually stopped to ask, what does the Bible really say about tithing? Not what does my pastor say? Not what does social media say? Not what does tradition say? What does Scripture actually say about it? What does Scripture say about tithing? Well, first off, let's define it. The word tithe literally means a tenth, 10%. But here's the first thing many people don't realize. The Old Testament tithe wasn't originally a church offering. There was no church. There wasn't even a New Testament yet. Israel was a nation, a functioning society with priests, festivals, agriculture, courts, and government. The tithe existed inside of that system. One of the clearest passages found in the book of Deuteronomy, the people of Israel were commanded to set aside a tithe of their produce and livestock. Why? Because the tribe of Levi, the priests, didn't receive land like the other tribes. Their work was serving in the tabernacle and later in the temple. The tithe supported them. But that's not the whole story. Many people talk as though there was only one tithe happening. The Old Testament picture is actually way more complicated than that. There were tithes connected to religious festivals. There were tithes connected to helping the poor. There were tithes connected to supporting the Levites. When you put everything together, some scholars argue that the total giving required under Israel's system was considerably more than 10%. So the point is this: the Old Testament tithe was part of God's covenant with national Israel. It supported worship. It supported the priesthood. And it helped provide for those in need. Now, let's talk about the verse that everyone knows. Malachi. Will a man rob God? You probably heard it. Usually you hear this one right before someone talks about giving. But what is actually happening? Malachi was speaking to Israel. The priests had become corrupt. The people were neglecting their covenant obligations. The nation was spiritually sick. God accuses them of withholding what they were commanded to bring under the Mosaic law. This wasn't written to a modern church congregation. It was written to covenant Israel. That doesn't make it irrelevant. But understanding the audience matters, because without context, people can make the passage say things it was never intended to say. Now we come to the question everybody really wants answered. Does the New Testament command Christians to tithe? Surprisingly, there is no place where the apostles command believers to give exactly 10%. That often shocks people because many assume it's repeated somewhere, but it isn't. Jesus doesn't mention tithing. For example, he criticizes the Pharisees for meticulously tithing tiny herbs while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Notice what he's doing? He's speaking to Jews still living under the Mosaic covenant before his death and resurrection. He isn't introducing a new Christian system of giving there. He's exposing hypocrisy. Then we move into Acts and letters. And the focus changes. The emphasis becomes generosity, willingness, sacrifice, cheerful giving, supporting ministry, helping the poor, meeting needs, listening to the language Paul uses. He doesn't say, every Christian must give exactly 10%. Instead, he says believers should give willingly, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, and that matters. Because Paul could have simply repeated the tithe requirement. Instead, he emphasizes the heart behind the gift. This is where many people get confused. Some Christians say, tithing is completely abolished. Others say, 10% is an absolute requirement. The Bible doesn't really fit neatly into either extreme. The Old Testament establishes a principle. God's people support God's work. God's people care for the needy. God's people recognize that everything they have ultimately comes from God. The New Testament continues those same principles, but instead of focusing on a fixed percentage, it focuses on generous stewardship. Think about it. If someone gives exactly 10%, but resents every dollar, have they fulfilled the spirit of the New Testament giving? Probably not. And if someone gives far more than 10% out of love and gratitude, they've gone well beyond the minimum question. One of the biggest misunderstandings is treating tithing like a divine membership fee. Pay your 10%, check the box, move on. That's not the picture Scripture paints. God has always cared about the heart behind the gift, even in the Old Testament. And the New Testament pushes that principle even further. So the next time you hear the word tithe, don't immediately think 10% or I'm disobeying God. And don't immediately think tithing doesn't matter anymore. The real question is deeper. How should God's people use what God has entrusted to them? Because that's the question running through both testaments. The Old Testament commanded Israel to tithe as part of the covenant God made with that nation. The New Testament does not explicitly command Christians to give 10%. Instead, it teaches generous, willing, sacrificial, cheerful giving. Can 10% be a helpful starting point? Absolutely. Many Christians use it that way. But the New Testament's focus isn't ultimately a percentage. It's stewardship. It's generosity. It's recognizing that everything we have belongs to God. So, take into consideration as well what you get from the church. And also realize they have to keep the doors open. And also realize if you're in a good church, they're giving. They're doing the things that they're supposed to do. They're helping the poor, the needy. They're helping their society. And they're spreading the word. How much is that worth to you? You make a decision. But when you give cheerfully. So when you read about tithing, you're not just reading about money. You're reading about trust. And now you know what you're looking at. You're not guessing anymore. You understand it. May the truth set us all free.